snoring when you get all nice, warm, and cozy.
Oh, it's like, ooh.
It's snoring from the cold.
It's on the other side, I think.
No, that's the one for.
Doesn't the remote lead you back too?
Okay, now we're live.
Did you hear her? We're live. I don't know.
I was just giving her warnings as far as what they said.
So it's that.
That's what it looks like. Got my recliner, my little heat going on here. See? I can.
Michael, do you guys have enough light without that light over your head?
7:30 and I already have no power in my watch.
Do you have enough light?
Does your watch run out of power?
Quite a lot.
No, but mine's new. Is yours new?
Yeah, I just bought it.
No.
Let the bulb flare out, thank you.
It definitely is making connection when
I
you
can do
charge
one
it.
more if you want.
Sometimes it doesn't sit right on that.
Yes. No, it's when I put it on in the morning, it's 100%. But by this time of night, it's like done.
Mine has 36% left.
Yeah, but it just flashed and said I have 10%.
Is it like how the regular iPhone, like, are your apps open? Like, is that a thing?
I don't know if that affects the
Yeah, I didn't know.
power usage or not.
Alright, thank you guys for coming tonight. I'm going to give you a little presentation on some of the rescues that we've done and what kind of goes into them and basically a behind the scenes look.
If you could speak up, that'd be great.
So everybody always thinks that this is what rescues are like. They're actually not like that at all.
Do you prefer them like that?
We get approached by a lot of reality TV series, and they're like, yeah, we have this perfect vision of like, you're gonna bust in there like SWAT style and take these animals. We're like, that is not it. This is it. Drive forever, all day long, all day long. We'll rescue cats all across the United States, even in other countries, but we don't go to get those cats. But yeah, it's just a lot of driving. So who gets rescued and why? Whenever we get a call for a rescue, we ask some questions like, what is the age and the condition of the cat? Because we have the facilities here to take care of cats that are sick or older, and younger, cuter cats are a lot easier to place. So we try to get as many cats placed as possible. So we always try to field out the younger ones to other places because they're more willing to take those cases than maybe something that's more difficult to take care of. So that's why we don't get a lot of young cats here. We also look at the enclosure space we have. So we have a certain number of small cat cages, leopard-sized cages, tiger cages. We're not really building more cages. We don't want to keep adding to our collection because we have a number of cats that we can house here comfortably where we know that we have the funds to take care of them and the people to take care of them. So we always make sure that we have the appropriate enclosure space, the funds to take care of that animal for the rest of its lifespan, projected lifespan. Should we not be able to do tours tomorrow, we want to make sure that we have adequate funds to take care of the animals that we're taking in. We also look at the number of volunteers we have and the color level. Do we have enough red shirts, yellow shirts, green shirts to take care of whatever that specific animal is? So there's a lot going into trying to decide which cats that we can take in. We also require that the owners surrender their license when we take an animal. So this gets rid of a lot of the requests really quick because a lot of people want to get rid of their older adult tigers that they can go out and buy a new young cub to play with. So we don't want to just rescue one animal out of a situation. We want to stop it at each individual owner. So that is one of the biggest things that differentiates us from other places. A lot of other places will just take animals and don't require anything of the owners. We also do paperwork. So we have to file for import permits with the state of Florida to bring animals in. And we have to coordinate veterinary assistance. Even though we have a great vet staff here, they're not licensed to work in other states. So if we're going to another state, we have to try to find a local veterinarian that'll work with us if it's a situation where we might have to dart an animal out of its enclosure because we can't transport drugs across state lines, and we can't, our vets can't use those drugs in other states. So it's always kind of challenging to try to find a veterinarian to help us, especially because a lot of the animals that we rescue come from really small towns, and that veterinarian's probably never even seen that big cat up close, much less practiced on. So when we're packing up everything for the rescues, we take everything that we need for every imaginable situation. So that's on the left there is kind of our packing list that we've put together over the years. We add to it every time we're on a trip, and we're like, man, I really wish I had this. And so we have a lot of the stuff already boxed up, and we keep it in the cat hospital. And some other things we have to collect before we go out on a rescue. We have to take rifles with us in case there was an emergency situation. We also take every kind of meat that we have and whole prey, because you never know when you're going into a facility what the animals will be interested in eating. So we take everything that we could possibly think of to make the rescue go smoothly. So this is our rescue trailer, and we just got a new van today that will also tow the trailer, which is nice. The trailer is fully outfitted with gear to help us monitor the animals while we're on the road, because they're in the trailer and we can't be in there with them. We have a camera set up that we can see in the cab of the truck, so we can keep an eye on them. We also have temperature gauges in the back, so we can make sure that they're comfortable back there. There's regulations on how high and low the temperatures can be when you're transporting animals, so it's really important to have that thermostat reader up in the cab where we can make sure we're maintaining those levels. The trailer also has AC unit on the top, and we just recently got an additional heat source for inside. So that's basically, what goes into prepping for a rescue. So I'm just going to show you guys some rescues over the past 10 years. Some of the cats that are in here may not be with us anymore, but their stories were compelling enough that I wanted to keep them in here. So we have Savage Kingdom. That was TJ. He arrived with 3 other tigers, Bella, Trusha, and Modnik. They came from one of the most notorious breeding facilities in the country. The breeder there was known for creating throwaway tigers. They were just very poor genetics. Some of the animals were born with horrible mutations. The owner, while we were there, he showed us a book that he had produced at some point in his life, and in it was a picture of a cyclops tiger that he had created from the horrible breeding that he was doing. He was famous in the 50s for his Big Cat Act, and for decades bred and sold tigers. His facility was shut down in 2006, and nearly a year later, all the animals were still living on the property, even though he didn't have a license to have them anymore. So as you can imagine, once these people lose their licenses, they're no longer inspected, so conditions can decline rather quickly. One volunteer had been remaining on the property to take care of the cats, even though she had no obligation to. She just felt bad for them and wanted to make sure that they were cared for until they could find homes. And there was a deadline that had been set at which all the animals that were left on the property were going to be euthanized. So we came in and took the last 4 cats. So these are some of the cages on the property. You can see broken pieces of wood that held the cages up. There's guillotine doors made out of old rotten plywood. Really, really terrible conditions, and really scary to imagine that they're keeping big cats in there. a lot of the places that we go to use a variety of little houses, wooden den boxes, and wooden crates as their dens for the cats. And as you can imagine, with the cats spraying the wood, it gets really rotten really quick, and they don't maintain these types of houses very well at all. I don't even know what's going on there, but that was a cage for an animal, and it kind of looks like something out of a cartoon, the door that's left there. Here's one of his training cages that he had on the property. So he had the table in there in the middle that he would get the cats on to perform tricks. And a lot of the cages were kind of kennel style, just one after the other. This was the inside of the enclosures. They also had an outside portion that they could get to with a dividing door. So here they are outside, just row after row, tiny little concrete cages made out of chain link, which has a lot of chain link is constructed with very thin, weak metal. And one of the cages here, a keeper was in a neighboring cage, and a tiger actually broke right through the wall and killed the keeper that was in there. These just are not structurally sound for keeping big cats. This was TJ and Bella's cage. You can see by comparison how small it is, the floor plan there. It was very tall, which was kind of weird because they only had some lower shelves, so there was a lot of wasted space. But it was really sad to see that that was all that they had. When they had all this grass out here, they just had concrete to live on. They had shift cages that they used to shift the tigers into these little night houses and give them turns into that bigger area. So when we got there, both TJ and Bella were just really depressed. Like, you've seen the tigers out here, and almost every single one of them will run right over to you, chuffing and rubbing on the fence, and they barely would lift their heads. They were just so down. They had dirty water dishes. You can see all the algae there growing in that dish. The wood on the platform back there was really rotten, and there's just exposed screws and nails everywhere.
I just can't hear you.
I can't talk louder than that. That's my high level. So here's just more. You can see on the left how destroyed that wood was. It was never replaced. And over on the right is their night house. So all the walls, again, are just made out of rotten plywood and boards that the cats could just easily bust out of if they tried.
You see nails sticking out of the wood down there.
Yeah, at the bottom you can just see the nails on the, and there's more coming out of the bottom of the platform. It was amazing that they didn't have more injuries than they did. One of the reasons you'll see a lot of concrete cages at different other facilities is they're easier to maintain. You just spray out everything that's in the enclosure. Hopefully they'll pick it up, but this place they just sprayed it out, and there's just a river of nastiness, fur and feces and bones that came out the back of the cage. So back when we did this rescue, we didn't have the equipment to transport big cats, so we had to hire a man that had a family-operated circus to come help us move the cats off the property. When we arrived, all 4 tigers were locked either in their shift tunnels or their den boxes, and we had to shift them from those unfamiliar surroundings into these transport cages that they had never seen before. There was a lot of people on the property that day, and these cats were well fed because of the volunteer taking care of them, so they weren't motivated to move for food. So it took a rather long time to get them each loaded into their transports. We only had a single transport cage and then another one that was divided into 2 sections. So we had to get each cat into the single cage and roll them over and shift them into the bigger transport. And let's see who's here. Over in the background there, you'll see Barbara Frank.
It looks like Liz on the corner there.
So here's the cage that we had to then shift them into. So it was a big process to get all these cats moved into the cages they need to be in.
There's also a lot of noisy neighbors milling around, horses and cows, and goats and chickens, pigs. And here on the left is the man that owned the tigers. He watched as each cat was loaded and taken away. He didn't really seem to be totally with it. He just kept telling us stories of his past when he was this great tiger trainer. So here we had to shift TJ through that concrete cage and into our transport, which you would think he was in that little tunnel. When we opened the door, he'd be like, there's no way I want to go into this terrible looking transport cage. But I think he kind of knew what was going on, and he just made a beeline right across the open space that he had to the transport cage and let us get him. Unfortunately, this transport cage didn't have any wheels. So we had to hand carry him across the property with the pigs and the cows running around us. So there you have Dr. Justin in the yellow shirt, Catherine right to his right, and Becky to her right. So we got all 4 tigers into the transports and we loaded them up into the trailer. They were about an hour and a half away from the sanctuary.
Look at my truck when it was new.
I know. Look at the graphics that used to be on the black top. So pretty. So this is TJ's first day at Big Cat. He absolutely was in love with all the grass. He would just face plant in big piles of grass and rub all over it, and he would just grab it and hug it and eat a bunch of it. He spent the whole day just playing with the grass in his cage. When TJ and Bella first arrived, they were separated because they weren't spayed or neutered. Bella was spayed, and they were later introduced, and this is how a lot of the conversations went between them. Her yelling at him, and him like, what did I do? So, unfortunately, for TJ, but not for Bella, we separated them, and they got used to it and eventually settled into their own spaces. Trusha passed away in 2009, and her sister 3 years later. They both suffered from mammary and reproductive cancers. This is common in cats that have been overbred for their life. In the wild, a tiger would breed every 3 to 4 years. However, breeding facilities like Savage Kingdom would force them to reproduce 3 to 4 times a year, just to produce the cubs for the demand. Eventually, 6 years after her rescue, Bella too passed away from mammary cancer. So next we have Joseph's Pride. Joseph's the last remaining member of that pride. It took USDA and undercover agents and concerned citizens of the town 7 years to shut down the International Siberian Tiger Foundation. And that place sounds really official, but it was not. The owner of the facility asked if she could move her entire operation to Big Cat at one point, and we offered to place the cats but refused to let her interact with them once they lived here. It wasn't until the landlords evicted the Big Cat owner for not paying her bills that authorities could seize the cats on the property that were used for years as props in training schemes. So the owner charged the public to pet big cats and have their photos taken with them, and that I don't know how that's even possible, but that is Joseph right there with somebody hugging on him. Most of the NAKITA with him?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's a different tiger. The owner of most of the cats were declawed and defanged. They were also chained during these interaction sessions. The facility was banned from doing interactions in 2000 and lost their license in 2006. However, they continued to do all of this until 2007. So for 7 years, even though they were told not to do something, they still continued to do it, and nobody stopped them from doing it.
Just like Dade City Wild Things.
And actually, going back to this one, we did get some inside stories from the landlords of Joseph not always cooperating, and apparently he did attack a paying customer one time and chased him across the yard and pounced on him and bit him in the back. I don't even want to think about being bitten in the back by Joseph. Gives me nightmares. It's not uncommon for cases of big cat abuse and neglect to take 6 or more years to come to any sort of fine or seizure of the animals. Like I said before, once the licenses are revoked, USDA backs off and washes their hands of the place, and then it's just left up to local sheriff's departments to deal with the animals, and they don't have any experience in what they're doing. We've had a lot of cats come to the sanctuary with really tight-fitting collars. You can see there, she's got one around her neck, and owners will put them on the animals at some point, and over time that animal becomes less handleable, and by the time they get here, the collars are usually deeply embedded in the skin and the fur because they've been wearing it for so long, but they've continued to grow. Shortly after Sasha was rescued, we sedated her to remove that collar. So the landlords were really helpful. They allowed us to go up to the property ahead of time to see what the cages were like so that we could make a plan for catching the animals. We made a visit and took a look at the property, and after the eviction of the big cat owners stopped taking care of the animals, so the landlords were also left with the daily care of the cats, and they were caring people, so they wanted to make sure the cats were fed and watered every day. Also involved in this rescue was HOWELL. And they provided food for the animals until they could be placed. So attached to the big yards that the cats had was this old barn divided up into separate den areas. And this was literally like what it was. Like there was no door on the outside, and right inside there is housing a big tiger. Well, actually the whole Joseph's Pride. So it's just, again, just more plywood and screws and nails that are keeping these big cats confined. Most other places don't have safety entrances, here there's none, and the latches or chains to keep doors closed are too small or in bad shape. So the only thing keeping him in there is that little chain with a snap. It's not even locked. So anybody could just, from the area, walk up there and unclip that and let out a bunch of big cats. It appeared as though the night houses not been cleaned in a very long time. The wood was covered in the nasty, greasy black film, and there was fur all over the floor, several inches deep. And just more rusty, corroded wire and old wooden framework. It's just every single place looks the same. Here they had a pool in their night house, but it hadn't been cleaned in a long time. It was just filled with green muck. And this was our really first large-scale rescue in which we partnered with the local Sheriff's Department, Humane Society of the United States, and IFAW, International, Fund for Animal Welfare. To remove the animals from the property in a single morning. Meanwhile, the owner of the facility parked on a hilltop nearby and was watching everything that we did. During our scouting trip, we discussed with the landlords how to build lockouts because the cats were just kept in their yards that had the attached night houses. There was nowhere to really get them into a smaller area. So they had some friends in the town that came over and helped them build feeding lockouts for each of the cats, and they used them up until the morning that we needed to capture them so that they were used to going in there and getting food every day. So lucky for us, all the cats were locked into their feeding lockouts that morning, but the progress was still very slow, as then we had to convince each of these cats to go from their feeding lockout into their transport cages. It took hours to get the cats to go. But one by one, each of the big cats were loaded into the trailer, and at that time we didn't have rescue trailer yet, so we hired 2 staff from Wild Animal Orphanage in Texas to help us transport the cats. At this time, Wild Animal Orphanage was one of the largest sanctuaries in the U.S. And in the red there, we have Dr. Wynn helping push Simba the tiger. I think this is the longest amount of time, well, maybe second longest amount of time that we've been awake during a rescue. Kansas was really close. I think we were up for like 30 hours by the time we got back here. All 4 cats were unloaded really early in the morning. And this is where Dr. Justin meets Joseph for the first time, and it was love at first sight. All four cats live together in the enclosure where Cameron and Zabu live now. It was a little bit different style enclosure, but the same area. Joseph loved Sasha very much, and Nakita was his best friend, or so we were told. However, Simba the tiger hated Joseph, and she would spend all her time in the pool just to get away from him. He was afraid of the water and wouldn't go in there after her. So we decided to separate Simba and Nakita into their own enclosures and leave Sasha and Joseph together. And here you can see she was totally defanged and declawed. And that's a big surgery to remove the fangs. We try to avoid that when we do dentals on the tigers here. We try to do root canals if possible, because the amount of root that goes up into their skull is just so huge, and when you take that much bone out of there, it leaves the whole jaw very weak. Once Nakita only had that mucky green tub of water to play in, he had the huge tiger lake to swim in, and he loved it. So there's Joseph on vacation. He's the last one left. He loves being on vacation and loves being way out in the middle of vacation, totally ignoring all the keepers. This is SERVIE's story. She was rescued from the Florida Keys. She was a marathon key. Her owner became ill and was mentally unable to take care of herself. She was Baker acted by the authorities, which means that she had an involuntary examination and was institutionalized. Sorry, my words. Animal control gained custody of SERVIE. Instead of transferring her to a shelter, which would have been very stressful for her, she was cared for at home until we could arrive. It had been long rumored that the woman owned a lion in her house. So when animal control got there, they really weren't sure what they were going to be dealing with. But it actually ended up being a serval. So anybody that's been to the Keys knows that the houses are very small. And we had taken all these crates with us, but they were too big to fit down the hallway to the bedroom she was locked in. So we decided to put the carrier at the end of the hallway and the other carrier on top to kind of block the hallway. And then we used all the couch cushions and pillows to close up the rest of the holes. And I barricaded myself in the room with her in a net and encouraged her to come out and run down the hallway into our crate. When she got here, she had a gold collar around her neck. She was super fancy. But she was definitely not tame enough for us to remove it. So we had to sedate her to remove the collar, and we did a quick exam at the time. And of course, it started pouring as soon as we were done with everything and putting her back in her enclosure. But there we are with her prize. This is Freddie and Sassy. There's only probably a couple of you that remember Sassy. They came from Cougar Bluff Enterprises, which was started by a couple of farmers in Illinois as a breeding facility in the 90s. Their backyard was a collection of 2 cougars, Freddie and Sassy, a lion, and a few wolves. In 2004, the husband entered the lion's enclosure to clean it and was bitten in the leg. He died from his injuries and the lion escaped. The authorities were called to the property, and because their farm backed up to a national forest, they had to shoot and kill the lion instead of try to dart it for potential danger to the people surrounding there. In 2010, we received a Facebook message asking us to help place 2 cougars after the wife had committed suicide. So her sister was left with these animals to try to find homes for. So this was Sassy's cage. It was very small, it had a rubber mat flooring. There was no roof on the cage to protect him from the snow. He didn't have a den box or anything to get out of the elements. There were no dividing sections in the cage, and there was also no safety entrance. So it made getting him into one of our transports quite challenging. But lucky for us, he was very food motivated and shifted pretty easily. He was actually supposed to be the harder of the two to catch, so we started with him and we were able to load him in just a few minutes. Here you can see that's another picture of Sassy's cage right up against the National Forest border. There's no perimeter fence around the property. There's also, the property was located right along the highway, and there was no perimeter fence at the highway to keep people from just stopping and coming onto the property. It appeared as though they allowed people to visit, as there was a rules sign near one of the cages. So no alcohol, no gum, and no petting. So they kind of had some good ideas, but I mean, really.
Must be under supervision by OWERBREEDING.
Yeah. I didn't even see that. So catching Freddie was very difficult. He was the favorite cat, so he had a den box in his cage. But other than that, it was the same situation. A rubber floor, nothing over top to keep the snow from going in there. He was very difficult to catch, very untrusting of us. Luckily, he did have a dividing wall in his cage. So when we go on these rescues, we also take a bunch of cage wire with us in case we have to build things. So we made from his dividing door, which you can kind of see the frame of right there, a chute that went all the way across the cage and to our transport. Even though we had this smaller area to try to get him through, I think it took us like 3 or 4 hours just to get him into a transport cage.
It was more like 6.
Well, I think total, like
for
for
the
everything.
whole day, yeah.
Yeah.
It was like 6 or 7 for the whole day, yeah. It was a long time.
So Freddie too had a collar embedded into his neck, and he was in very poor health when he arrived. He was so skinny that the vet team didn't think he would survive being sedated right away. So we decided to just work with him, and with a lot of time and patience using a scratcher, he eventually allowed us to cut the collar free without sedation. Both cougars lived in outback where the tigers are for a while. Their first steps into their new enclosures were very awkward because they had been living on those rubber mats nearly their whole lives. And so when they felt the dirt and the grass under their feet, they were high stepping because they didn't understand what that feeling was under their paws. So here's a little video of Freddie playing in the pool. Freddie passed away 6 months after his rescue. He had a cancerous mass in his intestines that was actually strangulating the intestines, so he couldn't eat food.
He's a good idea.
Yeah. He was so determined, and then you see Sassy in the background, like, you're crazy, man.
Were there fish in there? Is that
I
what
think
you
he's
said?
after a stick,
Oh.
like a piece of a palm frond that fell in there. And Sassy passed away 6 years later due to kidney failure. But during his time here, he was one of the enrichment cats. He loved all kinds of enrichment and thoroughly enjoyed shredding it into a bazillion pieces in his enclosure for the keepers to pick up. This is the New York servals, which the last remaining one we have is Simba. A couple in upstate New York had 5 servals as pets. They kept all of the cats in a cage in their basement, but they were allowed access to this dungeon type room while supervised. With the exception of one escape, they had spent their entire lives indoors. The space was very small, crowded, full of junk. The woman had been diagnosed with cancer, and her sister abandoned her 3 kids with her. And on top of that, she was in foreclosure. So she was forced to give up the cats, 4 of whom had been purchased at the same local pet shop. The 5th, Doodles, was an unwanted pet of a Florida man that made its way to her house. So this is the cage that they had. They were very proud of this custom dungeon-like cage, but it was like a floor pan of like 5 foot by 8 foot that the 5 servals had to live in. All 5 servals were packed into the BCR van for the 20-hour trip back to the sanctuary. It was very, very smelly right away.
Yeah, the minute
We
shut the
we
door.
bought a lot of air fresheners on that trip.
Stinky.
In preparation for their arrival, their enclosure was connected to 2 existing enclosures, which makes up all of what Killoan and Dryden have now. And here we have Chelsea helping out with their release. Because of the number of the cats all living together in the same enclosure, and their similar, very rounded body shapes, we needed to make an ID chart. So this is actually a sign that was on their cage that kind of showed you the spot patterns on each cat to help you identify them. The easiest one to tell apart from the rest was Santino because he had one bent over ear. But other than that, they were all very, very, very fat servals. They were probably 10 or more pounds overweight, which is, it can be very detrimental to their health. It can cause a lot of their health problems, just as much so as being emaciated. So with a healthy diet and plenty of room to exercise, each of the servals regained their lean shapes that they should have had, and that were always hiding under that extra fluff. This is a story of a cougar that we actually just helped transport. A big cat owner in Texas died, leaving behind their collection of 20 cats. So, there's this a common theme. We're hearing, like, these people end up with a collection of big cats and then they pass away or become sick and can't take care of them. But they have no plans for what's going to happen if they're gone. So all these animals are just left lingering, and, volunteers or family members are there to have to find homes for them. Another facility in Texas took in a few of these cats and helped find homes for the rest. A friend of ours runs Safe Haven Wildlife Sanctuary in Nevada, and they had room for Abel, but they couldn't transport them because they're a very small operation, so they don't have enough people to be able to leave the property to do rescues. So we picked up Abel and drove him across the country to Nevada. The trip took nearly a week, and there he is going into his new enclosure. He had a very spacious mountainside habitat. All of their cages are pretty large and nice. So with no cargo on the return trip, we stopped up at a few places along the way to make the most of our time. The BCR van may or may not have raced on the Bonneville Salt Flats.
What happens in Utah stays in Utah.
So while we were on the road, we got a call from Carol about some tigers in Texas and a special request. So remember Wild Animal Orphanage, the largest in the U.S.? They filed for bankruptcy and were forced to find homes for over 400 animals after having been in operation for 24 years. So they were like the biggest and the best, and they failed. At the time of our visit, several primates and a handful of tigers remained. These tigers were all kept together in one large cage with no way to separate them for feeding. Large chunks of meats were just tossed over the cage walls, causing a frenzy and panic over food. It's no wonder, after having spent years under these circumstances, that these cats had behavioral issues. That's the way she's looked at me from day one. I'll mess you up, is what that says. So in 1997, a couple had visited a pay-to-play operation in New Jersey. They didn't know any better at the time, but had since grown to regret their support of the cruel industry. They knew many of the cats from New Jersey had been taken to Wild Animal Orphanage and wanted us to help ID the cubs that they had played with 14 years previously. We stopped at Wild Animal Orphanage and photographed all the remaining tigers, and the middle cub in the photo is actually a baby Arthur. So the one on the left, it's baby Arthur. So we were able to ID these cats using the stripe patterns on their faces. So this is the facility in New Jersey where they were originally rescued from. So you could just see how terrible it was. They had nothing dry to get out of the mud. There are no den boxes. They're very crowded in small cages together. We were able to get a match or a partial match of 6 tigers to the cubs that they had once played with. These donors funded the rescue of Apatha, Andre, and Kylie, and they requested Apatha's name be changed to Arthur and Kylie's name be changed to Amanda. In addition, they also funded the rescue of the other ID'd tigers to go to other facilities. A month after we visited Wild Animal Orphanage, we were back to pick up the Texas trio and transport them to Big Cat Rescue. We now had a rescue trailer, but it was too small. We set out to find a new transporter now that Wild Animal Orphanage was out of business, and came across a couple who helped with a lot of domestic animal rescues across the country. So like puppy farms or puppy mills that get shut down, they help transport those animals to shelters where they'll be adopted. We convinced them to help us. They had no big cat experience at all. And this was their very first big cat rescue. So when we got to the Wild Animal Orphanage, we were not allowed on the property until the cats were captured and relocated to the main parking area, which is probably a good thing. So here's a little bit of their rescue video. The rest can be watched at bigcattv.com, as well as videos of all of our rescues. In the video, you'll see what happens when facility staff did not heed our advice regarding strapping the transports to the bobcat that they were using to move them.
One by one. Obviously, they were stressed and not used to large groups of people, and they were definitely letting us know. Unfortunately, when they were unloading the last tiger from the trailer, the transport cage dropped, damaging a wheel and adding to the stress level of the cats.
So there was nothing holding that onto the bobcat. It could have just flipped over.
The tigers as soon as possible into the cool, dark trailer. We loaded Arthur first and strapped the transport cage in place. You can see here the camera that let us observe the tigers from the cabin of the truck on the way back to Tampa. Andre was next, and he loaded really well, but the female, Amanda, was very upset about the moving. But they all settled down, and once all the transport cages were secure and they all had water for the journey, we didn't waste any time and got back on the road. It took about 22 hours driving straight through back to Big Cat Rescue in Tampa. All 3 tigers traveled well, and we kept an eye on them throughout the journey on the monitor. We arrived back at the sanctuary and were greeted by the media, and then by tiger wolves. By this time, all 3 tigers were definitely ready to get out of the trailer and into their new enclosure. Amanda was being particularly aggressive and literally tore chunks from her transport cage. This was just the wooden trim and did not affect the integrity of the cage. And to make matters worse, the wheel on the cage had been bent out of shape in Texas, so attaching it precisely to the actual enclosure took longer than expected. But after one final spurt of aggression, she stepped into her new home and headed to the pool for a drink, while the transport cage headed in for repairs.
This is definitely the most stressful, I think, unloading of cats. Excuse me, heartburn just watching it.
Strapped up to the enclosure and slid the door up to give him access. He entered the enclosure understandably grumpy and then decided to make sure we all knew how much. Last but not least, we unloaded Arthur, who was equally annoyed and leapt into his new enclosure as soon as we opened the door. These tigers are without a doubt the most aggressive we've ever dealt with. They were extremely scared.
So, I mean, definitely contributing to, I mean, a rescue is going to make the cat stressed out to begin with, but also having lived in the situation that they had where there's a dozen or more tigers all living in one space and having to fight over food on a daily basis, it really made them very difficult to work with in the beginning. But it was kind of the most relaxing rescue, as we only had to load and unload the animals, and we were driven the rest of the way in this fancy RV.
I know, that's probably the most relaxing, like you say, relaxing.
We just took naps and played on
ride.
our phones the whole time.
Except for the flat tire.
So we stopped at a rest area for a bathroom break, and when we got out of the rig, we noticed we had a flat tire. The good news is that they had a spare. The bad news is that it was in the trailer behind all the angry tigers. So we had to park way in the back of the rest area, because every time that we stopped for gas or anything, the whole trailer is just roaring and shaking. So we wanted to be far away from people so that we didn't draw a crowd while we were changing the tire. Yeah. So thankfully for these tigers, Big Cat will be their forever home. These two have mellowed out a lot since their arrival. Amanda is just still Amanda. She's nice to some people. So the Kansas cats. Amanda had failed attempt at breeding center in his backyard. At some point, he could no longer keep the cats, and he convinced his son-in-law to allow him to move the cats onto his property. Eventually, he stopped caring for the cats altogether, and the son-in-law was left with these animals that he didn't want. He contacted the local sheriff's department and asked for help. In an unusual effort, the sheriff's department seized the animals and ensured that they would be cared for while they searched for permanent facilities to take them. This rescue was very challenging, as we had to work together with the sheriff's department, HSUS, the Kansas City Zoo, all of whom have different protocols of safety and how to work with animals. I'm just gonna go back. So here you can see this is the highway going through the town, and just off the highway is all the cages. There's nothing keeping people from these cages. Again, they're just out in the open. So right near the cages was a very large pit that had been dug out, filled with tree branches and garbage and dead animals that had been discarded just feet from where the survivors were located. And let's see, can you find the serval in that pit of garbage? It was just laying out in the open. It was Ginger's mate. So he had died and been thrown aside into the pit, not even buried. Sadly, the law doesn't protect cats like this serval. Nearby, however, there were the remains of an endangered white pelican, which would result in some sort of fine eventually. So right above him, you can see some white feathers. The authorities were more interested in the bird than the cat because different regulations for each. So these two cougars here were going to another facility. Oops. And there was a tiger cage at the end of the row, held together with zip ties and fingers crossed. So a lot of times when we go to these places, we first inspect the cages because they're usually in such poor condition that an escape is imminent. And with the stress level of the animals and all the new people on the property, we always want to make sure the cages are really safe before we start doing anything. The tiger cage actually had a very large hole in the side that the person had just taken a piece of a log and put it in the hole and used a bunch of zip ties to tie it to the chain link, and that was the repair. This cage is also very small. You can see the tiger could only take maybe 2 or 3 steps in either direction. It had 2 sections, and it did have a den box, which is unusual for these type of places. So here's Ginger's cage. It was about 9 feet by 12 feet. Very, very tiny. She shared walls with the cougars next door. The cages were just absolutely filthy. She had 2 really dirty dens to hide in, and she was the first to be captured. We had a lot of meetings with the other organizations that we were working with about what was going to unfold once we got into the property. And the authorities told us that we couldn't take pictures or video. So we put away all our stuff and we decided to go and catch our cats first so we could get on the road because we had the longest distance to drive. So we went in and we netted Ginger, and one of the stipulations that the Kansas City Zoo had for helping us was he wanted to draw blood on all the cats and vaccinate them, I think.
No, I think they just drew blood and
blood.
gave them a checkup,
Yeah.
but they wanted to sedate all of them.
Yeah.
And we
So
were
they-
like,
Yeah, they wanted to sedate all the animals, which wasn't ideal for us because we had such a long trip home, and you can't start traveling until the animals are all awake enough to be okay without a veterinarian nearby. So he agreed to let us net these cats and draw blood in the net, which we've been successful with here. So we go in the cage and we net her out of her den and pull her out, and he's drawing blood, and I look up and every single person on the property has come to the front of that cage, and they all have their cell phones out and their cameras and videotaping them. So it was just like all hell broke loose in the first 5 minutes of the rescue. It was a free-for-all. In order to provide health certificates, was the reason that he wanted to draw blood on each of the cats. So here we are going into another cage to net the bobcats. So this doghouse was Mary Ann's only shelter from the snow and rain, and it was filled with dead animal carcasses. Once we got her out and opened it up, it just had all kinds of bones and skulls, and it was just so gross. Mr. Howe and Lovey were housed together and intact for breeding purposes. Their cage was about 9 feet by 15 feet. And again, they only had this single house to share. Skipper's cage was the largest of the 6 cats that we rescued. And Gilligan's was definitely the smallest. He was purchased from an animal auction. His owner had hoped to breed him and sell the kittens. So with no way to shift Gilligan out of his cage, it hadn't been cleaned in several months. There was not a single place for him to sit that wasn't covered in feces. It's just all over the floor. It looks like mud on the floor, but that's not mud. It's just all feces ground up into the hay. And you can see how disgusting that little table you had was. There was actually, the cage was so small we couldn't even get into it with a crate and nets to catch him. So with the wire that we had brought with us, we constructed a safety entrance, and we put the crate in there and hoped that he would go in the crate on his own. So while we were doing that, the owner storms onto the property and gets into an altercation with the sheriff. It was a very small town, and they were all yelling at each other by first name, and he ended up knocking the hat off of one of the sheriffs, and then they took him to the ground and arrested him and took him away, which was good for us. You never know when you're at these places what's going to happen when the owners come to if the owners come to the property, if they're going to be unstable. When they searched his car, they found a crack pipe in the front seat along with a shotgun. So Gilligan was the only one that would not load without sedation. So we ended up having to sedate him to do his exam. And so here we are loading them into the rescue trailer. And then, of course, it seems like every rescue, flat tire on the side of the highway. This is on the side of the big highway through Atlanta. People are rolling down their windows saying, "We love Big Cat Rescue! Help us then, please." So this is in the very early morning hours. I think it may have even been a weekend, so it was really difficult to find a place to fix we had brake problems along with the flat tire. So the brakes had seized up, putting pressure on the tires, which wore them to shreds. We found a repair shop nearby with the right parts for the trailer. And so after a couple of hours, luckily, we were able to get back on the road. Gilligan now has a much larger space to call home. This was his first home. Whose cage is that? Yeah, maybe, yeah. No, one of those over there on that road.
yeah. It's the one next to Tiger Lily, where little Dove was.
Lovey was spayed shortly after our arrival and was reunited with Mr. Howell, and the pair couldn't be happier. When Mr. Howell first arrived, his fur was very short, and we thought maybe he was some kind of hybrid. He just looked so weird. But after several months, his fur grew back, and he was definitely a very handsome bobcat.
He looks like such a baby on the right.
thought he was part caracal.
Yeah, we thought he was like a
He's all
bobcat
red.
caracal hybrid because he was so red too. Having no grass or plant life at all, Jim was very excited to explore her new home. And Marianne was fairly young and energetic, as was Max. Normally adult cats do not do well when introduced, however this pair was young enough to give it a go. And Max and Marianne were introduced and have been inseparable ever since. So that makes us very happy that they have someone to share their time with. And I've never seen any cat just spend the first few days of their rescue just smelling the air. Gilligan was just smelling the fresh air all the time.
Smell like poop.
Yeah, he just that was his look for like the week after we rescued him. The sheriffs returned to the site with permission of the landowner, and they filled in that pit and erected this monument to those who perished. This next one is the New York Tigers. In 1997, a couple started J&K's Call the Wild as a rescue facility. They were soon in over their heads and began breeding the animals to sell in order to fund the care of their rescued animals. After years of citations from USDA, their license was revoked. However, their daughter had applied for one under her name, and all the animals remained at the property, and the operation continued. It wasn't until the daughter and the parents got into a falling out in which the facility lost its license for good. So in the wake of the Zanesville incident involving the release of more than 50 dangerous carnivores and the suicide of their owner, New York State Attorney Office decided to send a message and set a precedent. So USDA contacted the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, who was joined by IFAW to aid in the rescue of the placement of all the animals. The seizure was kept quiet until the night before. All the participating organizations met in a hotel room to have a briefing on the situation before the rescue. The next morning, everybody was staged at the Highway Patrol headquarters, and one by one, each rescue organization was taken to the property to remove their animals. This was definitely the most heavily armed rescue that I've ever been on. There were roadblocks before and after the property. There was armed police officers everywhere. Lots of shotguns being carried around. The cages, again, just feet away from the main road through the area. So definitely dangerous to the public. It was obvious that the property had not been tended to in a very long time. There was just garbage and debris and junk littering the whole property. This is what everything looked like there. Concrete or gravel floors, again, it's common. They're used by backyard hoarders to make it easy for them to clean up the cages. But it's a very unnatural substrate, especially this large gravel for these cats to walk on. They were very thin. They hadn't been fed in a long time. And if you look in the middle of the cage on the left side, you'll see that lump. It was a dead cat that had been thrown into the tigers, and neither tiger had any interest in eating it, so it just lay there rotting. Domestic animals are often better protected by law, so while nothing would probably happen to the owners for allowing the lions and tigers to starve to death, the emaciated horse would probably result in some sort of legal action. And so he was just skin and bones in that little shack. This was the perimeter fence around the animal enclosures. There is a large access gate near the sheriff's deputy there. We were required to take all of our transport cages and our equipment and everything into that area, and then the sheriff's department locked us in there so that if the cats got out, the public would be safe. We would not be safe because we were locked in there. It was very sketchy, but you have to deal with the authorities when you're on site. Kimba was Zeus's mother. Her cage was very sad. It was tiny and just had the rock flooring, As you can see by the surrounding area, there's lots of nice grass that these cats could have had, but they were kept in these tiny rock cages. Kimba had no access to water in her cage. The small amount of floor space felt even more claustrophobic by how low the roof was. It was probably only as high as my head. This was this is two photos here. So that's on the left, a picture of the inside of her cage. On the right is the outside of her cage. And there's a slide door right there. There was no wire behind it. I was a little curious, and I picked on the corner up there, and this huge chunk fell off. I'm like, oh. So that's all that was I could have probably just pulled that off with my hand easily. And that's all that was keeping this poor cat in there. I can't believe that living in those conditions, she hadn't already escaped. Here's Zeus's cage. It's behind Keisha's sign. Zeus was bred to his mother, Kimba, which resulted in the birth of Keisha. Keisha's enclosure was also very tiny. That's all of it right there, what you see in the picture, that rectangle of rock. She shared a common wall with two lions to her side, and that's most likely how she lost her tail. So because of how the cages were, we had to actually cut a hole in the side of Keisha's enclosure so that we could get her into our transport box. So while we cut this hole, we locked her in that little wooden den box attached to the outside of her enclosure. And you can see the den box is very close to the cage wire at the bottom, but at the top there's a bigger and bigger gap, and there's literally nothing holding that wooden box to the side of her cage. On the outside of the den boxes were these very high-tech secure poles with metal strapping and screws. It looks like nothing could get out of that. And here you can see there's some padlocks in there. They're missing the locking part. I'm sure that it's just as good. So Keisha willingly went into the transport for food. She was very hungry. Zeus shared walls with both Keisha and the two lionesses, and the whole time we were there loading up the other cats, he spent in his den sleeping, and we thought he was going to be the most difficult to catch. But once he was allowed access out of the den box, and he had no desire to move there, you can see Carol opening the door, and he's just sleeping in there. But then he was shown a chicken quarter, and I've never seen a cat run across a cage so fast and jump. I think if that transport wasn't attached to the side of his cage, it would have just shot out of there how hard he hit it for that chicken. So here's a look at Zeus's den box. Again, very high-tech and secure. So it's unknown how long Kimba had been without food or water. Here you can see how thin she was when she arrived. She was sedated for an exam shortly after her arrival, and you can see here she had a very bad declaw at some point in her life. So they probably weren't done by a veterinarian. They were probably just done on site by the owners. And the claws were growing back all curled and gnarled and growing into the top of her foot and into the paw pads. So that must have been very painful to have all those deformities in her claws and to have to walk on that gravel floor every day. Sadly, Kimba passed away a week after her arrival. She had acute kidney disease, most likely brought on from having no access to water where she was. And unfortunately, the effects were irreversible. We tried to give her fluids and different medications, but the damage had already been done. Keisha, surprisingly, was very restless when she first arrived. She still is. She may have been concerned that she would end up sharing a wall face-to-face with another cat. So she was always looking around to see, is there something that's going to jump out at me? But she's calmed down some since then.
There's always a need.
Yeah, always a need. So Zeus was so thin when he arrived. His back end was very tiny. He had no muscle or fat. His backbone and his hip bones just stuck out really far. He doesn't look anything like that now.
It took a long time to get him up, though, to get him built up like that.
So here he is with his very first Christmas tree, which he loved so much, and he's filled out a lot since then. This is Mickey's rescue. He came from a place called Animal House, which was a backyard zoo that doubled as an animal shelter for domestic dogs and cats. The owner fed the dogs and cats that were surrendered to her collection of big cats and bears. A live Doberman was fed to this leopard, and it severely injured the leopard's leg. The owner said the leopard was too old and refused to allow a vet to sedate it for an exam and treatment. Authorities refused to require veterinary care be given to the leopard. So we were sent these pictures by a person that had visited the facility and was very concerned for, obviously, for the health and well-being of this cat. And we tried to step in and offer to have our vets go there and take a look at it and provide all the care for free, but they absolutely refused, and the leopard died soon after. The owner of the facility was suffering from dementia, and her son and volunteers took it upon themselves to get the animals placed elsewhere. The grounds hadn't been maintained in a very long time, and the growth around the cages was just impenetrable. So on the left, you could see the weeds and the trees and bushes and everything were so thick you couldn't even walk around the outside of these enclosures. So this is half of Mickey's cage. It was shut off, and we were inspecting the den to see what was in there. And this was where Mickey was. This was his den box, which had a blind corner. So inside the den box, he could go in and walk around this little wall partition and be completely non-visible from the outside, which is very difficult for us to be able to see what we were dealing with. So here's a little bit of his rescue.
Because Mickey feels safe in his den, we decide to lock him inside of it.
From there to the side of the cage and try to get it right into our transport. So you can't come out of the cage, you don't go out the tunnel.
So we're always having to get creative with how we get these cats into our
Justin are
transports.
seen here securing Mickey's second den so he can't get in it while we bring in the crate. With a plan in place, Jamie and Regina first stick our two carrying poles to the outside of the fence over his other den opening to slow him down if he tries to attack us when we enter, in order to clip a panel of wire over the den opening. Moving a scared and neglected big cat from one enclosure to another can be quite challenging, and we take great caution when attempting this. Nerves race for a moment as Jamie and Doris rush into Mickey's cage to quickly attach a piece of fence over the opening of the den, securing him inside.
This was all with hidden cameras.
Yeah.
That's why it's so bad.
Scary stuff.
So that's you don't need coffee in the morning. Yeah. So what's your plan for getting him out of there and into the...
Hi, not head. Yeah, you busted at me.
You see it down there?
His
The
head.
spotlight? As it's blind corners, I don't know.
It's real shape in there.
Yeah, well, that thing, we could open it, and there is a little thing over here, a little grating thing. There's only more bolts. I think you're right. You could just take this off, and it'll roll that way to the corner. We can bring our cage right through here. Take this and come down.
Here we go, cut this thing loose. We have to rip away the cage wall to get our transport into place in front of his den opening, and have to cut through the piping because it is too tall. Somebody holding it.
But actually, they'd use a piece of this wire on the wooden walkway just so we could walk across it, because all the boards were rotting and breaking under our
The scary
feet.
thing is, if they go to sleep out there in the weeds, you don't know when they went to sleep. Joel, the former keeper, seeing her cutting the wire and carrying the crate, was a great help to the team.
I mean, this is all, we haven't even seen this cat yet, so we don't even know it has knee problems at this point. We're just trying to get it out of the box.
We rig a guillotine door to drop when Mickey exits the den. Good job.
Yeah.
We all left the area hid in the brush, except Jamie, who held the rope to drop the guillotine door. When Mickey was sure we were all gone, he ventured out and into the transport cage. Jamie dropped the door and caught him. Everyone was so relieved to see Mickey safe and secure inside.
So then once we saw him, we knew we were dealing with much more than we had anticipated. So in this rescue, I was actually on my way out of town for vacation. So once Mickey was loaded up, Carol and Regina drove him back to Big Cat Rescue, and we stayed on the property to help get the rest of the cats loaded up into their transports for the other facilities. The cage walls were approximately 8 feet high. This is a little barricade in the front, but then behind there you can see the cage wall. It's just chain link with nothing, no overhang, no hot wire, nothing. You could see around the whole outside, all the vines and everything on the enclosures made it impossible to see the boundaries of the cage from any angle. Here's a little video of that particular cage.
7, maybe 8 feet high. There's a lion and
I mean,
a tiger somewhere.
Yeah, there's 2 big cats somewhere in there. It's just eerie. So it was completely terrifying to figure out how we were going to get these cats out of this enclosure with no real confirmation on how many for sure lived in the cage. We knew there was a lion and a tiger. We didn't know if they were spayed or neutered, or if they had like 15 cubs in there that have grown into adults by this point. Like, it was just a guessing game. So from what we could tell, this was a diagram of how the cage was constructed. So there's one big, large open area, and then they had this like 2-roomed, smaller area with one guillotine door that goes into it. But this is what it looked like. Like this all, we could see this much of what we were dealing with. The transport cage was hooked up to the exterior door to the first smaller room. The tiger had no interest in going into the transport whatsoever. We got the tiger into that smaller room first off. So when looking through the wall of the first room, you can barely even make out the details of the second room where that blue den box is back there. So it was incredibly difficult with the amount of vegetation there to see what we were dealing with. This is us actually in the cage. This is how high the weeds were in the enclosure. And we had to actually enter the cage to dart the animal that was in the second room there. Both cats were sedated and put into transport cages. And the craziest thing about these 2 cats in particular, is the transporters that we normally worked with, the ones that we started using at Wild Animal Orphanage, were hired by a zoo to pick up these cats, and all they had was the transport crates. The zoo didn't send any staff or supplies to help get them into transport crates, and these aren't animal people. They're people that like to help dogs and cats, and they run a motorcycle shop. So they didn't have the experience to go in and catch these cats, and they didn't have a vet to help them. So we helped them along with Carolina Tiger Rescue, who was there picking up their cats. On this particular day, there was one tiger up here behind the dog. that was not allowed to be removed that day. The owner became really agitated about the animals leaving the property, but she was suffering from dementia, like I said, and the volunteers were really good at distracting her from what we were doing. So she had this very fancy collection of painted eggs in her house that she was very proud of. So every time she would venture outside and start yelling at us and fighting with us about taking the animals away, they'd ask her to see the egg collection, and she'd be like, oh yes, and she'd take them in her house and talk about her egg collection for an hour or so. So it was really sad to see somebody in that state, but it's again just another variation of what we have to deal with when we go to these rescue sites. Again, just these cages, they're just the same everywhere. They're so dilapidated and so unsafe. They're just put together with Mod Podge of wire and wood and other materials, rusting and falling apart. This tiger was starting to, back in the back there, was developing similar knee issues to Mickey. So we're not sure if it was a result of diet that could have caused that, or a lot of them had really high platforms in their cages, so they had to jump really high to get on them, but then they would have to jump down onto concrete floors, which is probably not good as well. There's a lion kept in a very tiny cage on the property. They had mop buckets for water dishes. These two tigers they must have been one of the favorites on the property because they were right up next to the house and their yard was nicer than the other cats. They were sharing a single cage with no dividing walls, and these were going to Carolina Tiger Rescue. Dr. Justin teamed up with the Carolina Tigers vet, and the cats were simultaneously darted because they had to both be asleep in order for us to go in there and pull them out. Timing was everything. Both cats were different in sizes and took different amounts of time to fall asleep. So one fell asleep really quickly, but we had to wait for the other one to fall asleep enough so that we could safely enter the enclosure. Once asleep, two teams entered the cage and we put the tigers on stretchers to remove them. When one tiger crashed, and then it had to be given emergency drugs to revive it, so it started to get light and started to wake up while it was being moved. So it's just another terrible situation in which there's no way to separate these cats, there's no way to get them into feeding lockouts, there's no way to effectively catch them and remove them from the cages if need be. This is Kali, where Kali came from. She was kept as a pet in a backyard in Georgia. When the couple got divorced, the owner wanted to find a new home for her. This is the entirety of her cage. There's just a large clay rectangle with a den box in the middle, and she had a bear as a neighbor. In this situation, the owner was willing to work with us. We dropped off our transport a week ahead of time, and he got Cully used to going into it for food. It was the quickest rescue we've ever been on. It was about 15 minutes. We just literally rolled the transport out, hooked it up to her cage, and she jumped right in. So here she is living the good life at BCR. This is Lakota's and Sue. The Mobile Zoo was shut down by USDA in November, I don't have a year there, for multiple animal...
2017.
Was it that year?
Well, that's what it says up there.
So they got shut down and then rescued in the same year? What? For multiple animal welfare violations. The zoo owner was arrested for 28 counts of animal cruelty. Animal control officers seized the animals on the property and found placement for all of them. During this time, some animals were smuggled off the property. We were supposed to rescue a serval from the zoo as well, but it had been smuggled across state lines by one of the veterinarians, and the authorities didn't have jurisdiction to follow them. 2 rescue groups arrived along with the Sheriff's Department, Animal Control, and the sole remaining keeper early in the morning. The zoo owner was a recluse and remained in his house on the property throughout the rescue and didn't come out once. This is the outside view of Sue and Lakota's cage. Some sort of animal had tried to dig into their cage, and this was the fix for that. Just a little board covering half the hole. Again, just barren, tiny, tight conditions. a lot more wood, den boxes, and the whole roof of the cage was being supported by this rotten log in the middle. Both bobcats were very scared of all the people and all the activities surrounding them. They were pacing a lot. Their water source on the left was basically a huge rodent bottle. So it had like the little end of the water bottles like we have for the rats, and then it was a huge PVC pipe, and the top was just open. So dirt falls in there, leaves fall in there, and they just keep adding water to it. There's no way to clean it out at all. Dog food was all over the floor in the cage. Apparently that's what they've been feeding the cats. There's also feces all over the cage. There's no way to separate the cats into different sections in order to clean. So that's just, it looks like mulch, but it's really just all poop. There are lots of animal bones in the enclosure as well. This was a spine of a goat or a sheep that most likely was one of the other zoo residents that had passed away. So most other facilities do not adhere to the rule that requires safety entrances. So we always take enough wire to build safety entrances when we get to these properties. So here on the left is the entrance to their cage, and here we've built our own safety entrance. And it always like blows people's minds when we like throw that up in 5 minutes with some snaps. It's like, well, you could have done this years ago. The cage had several holes throughout it that bobcat could easily fit out of. There was a lot of rotten fencing at the bottom that I could stick my whole boot underneath. And so here's a little perspective of that's pretty much half of their cage right there, and 2 people standing in it. It shows you how small of a space that they had. They were just little furry pinballs bouncing off the walls. We had to enter into the cage with both of them and both our crates and our 4 people and our nets. And I think it was probably really terrifying for the people that I took with me, because they were literally just jumping over our heads and running around the enclosure. But luckily we just focused on one at a time, and we were able to net them and get them into crates without too much fuss. And so here's a little video of Lakota enjoying some enrichment after his rescue. And so it's 100% thanks to you guys sitting in those chairs that all these cats have been rescued. You clean the enclosures, you feed the animals, you do the tours, you work in the gift shop. All those things add up and contribute and are what enables us to go all over the country and take these animals out of these horrible situations and give them really the best life possible. So I would like to give you guys a hand. And that's it. Any questions? Yes.
You said Kali was a pet, but I thought Kali's owner ran a sanctuary, and somebody dumped a bunch of tigers there, and Kali was the one that was born, and then he closed the sanctuary, and Kali was the last one. Was that not the case?
That was true, but he had raised her as a pet.
But I don't know how he had more animals there, because he only had 2 cages. He only had hers and bear.
I'm thinking like 30 or 40 animals at one point.
Maybe they tore him down or something. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, he went in there and interacted with her on a daily basis and bottle fed her up through adulthood and really treated her as a pet. Any other questions?
People are saying have safe travels tomorrow. And great job, Jamie, and awesome.
Yeah, so we'll be getting 2 more cats tomorrow. We're leaving at 3 o'clock in the morning to drive up and get them, and we should be back here around noon, hopefully. So exciting. All right, thank you guys.
Thank you.